When the prophet Zarathustra appeared before King Vishtaspa and demonstrated the superiority of his magic, the court magicians, fueled by their own jealousy, had him imprisoned for practicing his forbidden powers. Later, when those same magicians were unable to serve the king remembered the magic of Zarathustra, which came from his god Ahura Mazda, and summoned the prophet from the prison where he had been kept. Once skeptical of the prophet's words, Vishtaspa was now converted to the religion this new prophet preached. The story was common in the ancient Near East, and its influence can be seen in the cultures that were later ruled over by the Persians. It inspired over a dozen scenes in the first two books of the Hebrew Bible, and its shadow is cast on prophets such as Jeremiah. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. In episodes 86 and 87, we covered the core of Jeremiah, which spans 25 chapters. In these next two episodes, we'll cover the material which was added onto Jeremiah, chapters 26 to 52. This episode will be divided into three sections: biographic material and other prophets in chapters 26 to 29, Yahweh's promise of restoration in chapters 30 to 33, and finally interactions with King Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem in chapters 34 to 39. This last section actually extends to chapter 45, but we'll be saving the remaining chapters for the next episode. The material we're covering today is a combination of first-person speeches and third-person narration, set during the period of the Babylonian conquest, often as Jeremiah attempts to prevent the invasion by changing the minds of Yahweh and the Judean populace. Our first section, the biographic material and other prophets in chapters 26 through 29, can be subdivided into three sections. The first in chapter 26, the second in chapters 27 to 28, and the third in chapter 29. Furthermore, because saying furthermore sometimes tricks people into believing I'm intelligent, we can divide each episode into a three-step formula. Jeremiah delivers an oracle, the people oppose the oracle, and the prophet Jeremiah is vindicated. The previous chapter ended with a vision of the coming destruction of Judah, but this chapter picks up a couple dozen years earlier in the reign of King Jehoiakim. We'll be doing that a lot in this episode, jumping forward and backward in time, as these oracles are dated through the reigns of Jehoiakim and Zedekiah. They most certainly are not arranged in chronological order. Jeremiah issues a dreadful prophecy regarding the destruction of Jerusalem, warning that if the people do not do as they are commanded by Yahweh, then the deity will make their houses like that of Shiloh. Shiloh was once a center for religious practices in Israel, but was destroyed by the Philistines in 1 Samuel. See episode 40, entitled 5 Golden Hemorrhoids for the whole story. This section was referenced earlier in Jeremiah 7, where it was also used as a warning of what would happen in Judah. Improper worship would result in the patron deity sending a foreign army to destroy his own temple. So Jeremiah is reminding the people that Yahweh did it once, so he isn't averse to doing it again. When Jeremiah finished his oracle, the people seized him for his seditious prediction and called for his execution. And if something about this scene sounds familiar, it will be used as inspiration for the New Testament authors to construct the trial scene for Jesus, as he predicts the looming destruction of the Second Temple at the hands of the Romans. It seems whenever a temple in Israel or Judah is destroyed by a conquering force, the resident religion is blamed and a splintered denomination uses the tragedy to prop up their own theology by claiming long after the fact that their prophet foresaw its destruction. The priests and prophets all agree with the enraged crowd that Jeremiah deserved death, and we see here that the author doesn't drop names. Who they are specifically is not important. Jeremiah doesn't have a singular opponent. His opponent is the temple cult itself. Court officials take up their positions near one of the entrances to the temple to hear the charges levied against the prophet, while the angry mob chants for his execution. Jeremiah states that his oracle came not from himself, but from Yahweh, and again calls for the people to heed the words and mend their wicked ways, so the deity might renounce their punishment. Once he delivers this message, he commends himself to their hands and asks that they deliver justice, but warns that if they execute him, they'll be guilty of shedding innocent blood. Remember from episode 64 that the shedding of innocent blood was one of the reasons given for the destruction of Jerusalem. So here he's reminding the crowd that they're already tempting fate by not renouncing their wickedness. Adding the slaughter of an innocent man to the charges against the city would certainly turn his warning into reality. Just as Pontius Pilate will later argue on behalf of Jesus, so too do the princes of the city claim that this prophet doesn't deserve death. To lend credence to Jeremiah's words, elders from across the land remind the crowd that Micah once gave a prophecy concerning the destruction of Zion, yet he was not put to death, offering precedent for prophesying doom without punishment. In the middle of this public trial, another prophet, Uriah, feared for his life, so he immediately fled the city and sought refuge in Egypt. I suppose the trial was paused because they waited for King Jehoiakim to send soldiers all the way to Egypt, capture Uriah, and return him to Jerusalem, where he was promptly executed for giving the same prophecy that Micah and Jeremiah had given. I'm not sure how long this episode took, but judging by previous travel times from Egypt to Judah, I'm guessing the round trip was about 80 years. Meanwhile, the angry mob waited for this to transpire before resuming their chants for the execution of Jeremiah. Finally, a man named Ahikam stepped forward and protected Jeremiah so that he wasn't killed. So, who was this man, and under what authority could he command an entire nation who sought the death penalty for hearing bad news? He appeared briefly in 2 Kings 22:12-14 as an official under King Josiah who wanted temple reform. So this man, who was no more of an authority than the princes and elders and prophets who agreed with Josiah, can single-handedly stamp his foot and end the entire ordeal, and this is never explained. My guess is the author was simply linking the two stories with the mention of a single obscure character in an effort to link Jeremiah with the popular reforms of a prior king. It's really just name-dropping to pad out the prophet's resume. Chapters 26 and 27 seek to undermine the nation of Israel prior to its destruction. It begins with the author stating, "Thus said Yahweh," or "Thus said Yahweh to me," depending on which version of Jeremiah your Bible uses. The words "to me" have been added to the Masoretic text in order to explicitly make Jeremiah the narrator of the story. The absence of this phrase in older versions likely indicates that it, and many other oracles found in this book, were anonymous or attributed to other prophets and were later gathered up and then attributed to Jeremiah, as subsequent scribes added on to the core of the book and the legend of the prophet. The orders issued by Yahweh, which are relayed by our anonymous author, command the listener to fashion a yoke for themselves to place on their own necks. This is directed to 3 audiences: the foreign kings, King Zedekiah, and all the people and priests. And one detail of note to mention before moving on is that the current king is Zedekiah, though the opening line appended to this oracle places this during the time of Jehoiakim. Yahweh boasts that he alone created the world and all that lives upon it, and he has given that world to Nebuchadnezzar, his servant, the king of Babylon. This too is an addition inserted into the Masoretic text. All the nations must serve him. He then offers his ultimatum to Judah and those nations listed in the opening lines of the chapter, to either serve Babylon and survive, or refuse to surrender and perish. But it won't just be Babylon who destroys the rebellious nations, but Yahweh himself, who threatens to personally visit said nations and bring the sword, famine, and pestilence. Thus, submission to Babylon is equated with submission to Yahweh. And don't worry, the pro-Babylonian rhetoric will not end here. No heed should be given to their prophets, diviners, and sorcerers who instruct the people to not serve the Babylonian king, for they are surely false prophets. Those who choose to serve Babylon will live on as vassal states. This same message was then delivered directly to King Zedekiah, another indicator that the opening lines, which state this was written during the time of Jehoiakim, were added later. If a prophet states that the temple vessels will be returned shortly, no heed should be given, for they are a false prophet, But if a true prophet arrives, let him intercede with Yahweh and beg that the vessels not be taken away to Babylon at all. An oracle is then added to the Masoretic text concerning the vessels, which are not taken to Babylon as loot. This oracle states that they will be taken away to join the others in Babylon until it becomes appropriate for them to be returned. See episodes 68 and 70 concerning the multiple stories surrounding the fate of these temple vessels. The next line, which opens chapter 28, places the scene early in the reign of Zedekiah, not Jehoiakim, giving us another jump in time. It begins with an oracle delivered by Hananiah and continues the yoke imagery introduced in the previous chapter. The yoke of Babylon will be broken, and all the vessels of the house of Yahweh will be restored, along with all the exiles of Judah who were taken away. Jeremiah then answered Hananiah by praising Yahweh for his decision to restore the people to their land, and praying for him to fulfill the prophecy. He declared that prophets foretell good and ill, but only when their words come true can they be known as true prophets sent by Yahweh to spread his word. This seems to come as a challenge to Hananiah's promise of restoration, so Hananiah responds by removing the bar from Jeremiah's neck and breaking it, symbolizing the removal of Babylon's yoke from the neck of Judah. Now set free from his bonds, Jeremiah stood as an example of the power of Yahweh's words and a symbol of the upcoming fulfillment of Yahweh's promise. All of this must have seemed rather strange to a people, as they bore witness to a symbolic restoration from an exile that wouldn't occur for another decade according to the setting of this oracle. It would have appeared to the angry mob that their captive, a raving madman who committed sedition, was set free by another seditious madman. But it all makes sense to the author, so it must make sense to us as well. Since Hananiah's prophecy stated that the people who hadn't yet been exiled and wouldn't be for another decade would be restored to their lands within 2 years of this scene taking place, yes, you heard that right, he predicted they would be returned 8 years before they would be taken away. Bill and Ted must have been involved. But because he predicted that they would be returned in 2 years' time, which wasn't the case, Jeremiah chose to curse Hananiah rather than thank him for releasing the prophet. He declares that Hananiah would die within a year, and so he did. Chapter 29 brings us to our third and final scene from the biographic materials section of Jeremiah. The chapter reports the correspondence between surviving people in Judah and those living in exile in Babylon. The chief concerns of these missives are Jeremiah's authenticity and the coming restoration of the land. It begins by declaring that what follows is a copy of the letter that Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, prophets, and elders living in exile, and to all the people Nebuchadnezzar had taken to Babylon from Jerusalem. It purports to contain words spoken to Jeremiah from Yahweh concerning the people. They're to build houses in Babylon and to live there, to get settled in and plant gardens, start families, be fruitful and multiply, and to better the city in which they now live, and work toward its prosperity. I told you the pro-Babylonian rhetoric would continue. As much as this faith claims to oppose Babylon, the empire's influence on their religious text is palpable. The text even goes on to state that if any prophet disagrees with these words, they're a false prophet. That's right, a true prophet of Judaism must be pro-Babylon. Beginning in verse 10 is the promise of restoration. After an allotted time has passed, Yahweh will remember his people who are living in exile and look to their well-being and offer a hopeful future. They will be gathered up from all the nations and brought to the land of Judah. Those who remain in Judah will be treated as loathsome figs, destroyed by sword, famine, and pestilence, made an example of for all the nations of the world. So the residents of Judah are not the true followers of Yahweh, but those who follow prophets from Babylon are. Let that one sink in. Interestingly enough, verses 14 and 16 to 19 are later additions to the Masoretic text and are not present in the oldest versions of Jeremiah. These are the verses that contain the rhetoric against the Judean people still living in the land and comparing them to rotten figs, while the invading slave army from Babylon is portrayed as the true heirs of the land that they have now captured. This allows us to see how a collection of oracles can be modified with just a few short sentences to drastically shift the meaning of the text and justify a foreign invasion, not by Babylon, but by the people who will come to call themselves the true Judean people, all while they are displacing those who were the true residents of Judah. We learn in verses 24 to 28 that a rival prophet in Babylon who lives amongst the exiles sent letters to Jerusalem, accusing Jeremiah of being a madman, and this led to Jeremiah's capture and imprisonment, which ended in the previous chapter. As a response to this, Jeremiah sends a second letter to Babylon, in which Yahweh himself decries the prophet Shemaiah and names him false, and promises punishment for this opponent of Jeremiah, who leads people astray with his lies. Isn't it convenient when a deity who can't write for himself chooses your side over your opponent's? Our next section of this episode spans chapters 30 through 33. The subject of this section of oracles is Yahweh's promise of restoration of the land and the temple. The nation of Israel, called Jacob in this section, is depicted as being Yahweh's firstborn son, and the troubling politics and theological differences are presented as familial disagreements that have divided father and son, and brought the household into a time of great distress. Of course, the ill treatment by Yahweh is considered to be a just response to his son's actions. It begins, of course, with a statement declaring that what follows are the words which are spoken by Yahweh to Jeremiah. Written in the third person, we know this isn't from Jeremiah himself, but someone else attributing his work to Jeremiah, and of course to Yahweh. He commands Jeremiah to write a scroll with his oracle that outlines Yahweh's intentions to restore the fortunes of his favorite ethnic group, which once inhabited the lands of Israel and Judah. This land was promised to their forefathers, and now the current, or rather the near-future generation, will march in and claim it. This is a typical post-exilic rhetoric in which the former slaves from Babylon claim that they're the rightful occupants of the nation, rather than its current inhabitants, because their deity offered it to a past generation. We know from other Jewish writings that many of these slaves weren't even from Judah, but were descended from people from across the Babylonian Empire who themselves had been captured and enslaved. Beginning in chapter 30, verse 5, we have the words supposedly written on Jeremiah's scroll, in which Yahweh states that he has heard the cries of his people during their time of trouble, but soon they'll be delivered from it. When the time comes, he'll break the yoke from their necks and strip off their bonds, freeing them from slavery. Instead of foreign masters, they'll serve Yahweh through his servant, who is a descendant of King David, which, ironically enough, was a foreigner, a Babylonian aristocrat named Zerubbabel. His claim to be a descendant of a legendary Jewish king was propaganda to lend authority to his governance over Judah. This allowed the invading slave army to claim that the land was theirs, while the local population was shoved aside. I'm glad to know such rhetoric was only used this one time for an invasion force to seize control of this territory, and it totally never happened again. Yahweh then promises peace to the exiles once they reach the Promised Land, which we know from episodes 68 and 70 was an empty promise. All the nations that house the dispersed population will come to an end, but Yahweh will also chastise his chosen people for their wrongdoing. They are stricken like an enemy and treated with cruelty by their God, who boasts of his assault on the people and blames them for his actions against them. They go into captivity because of their own sins and were pillaged on Yahweh's command. But now he commands their captors to be pillaged, a reference to Babylon's defeat at the hands of the Persians. Now their cities will be rebuilt and the population increased. A new ruler will be raised up, a possible reference to Cyrus of Persia, whom we encountered in the Isaiah episodes where Yahweh raised him up to rule and named him Messiah. Yahweh is depicted as a storm god in verse 23, who goes forth as a raging tempest to vent his anger and sends whirlwinds to smite his enemies until he brings them to ruin. In chapter 31, Israel is no longer seen as Yahweh's firstborn son, but instead as a maiden that Yahweh here considers a faithless daughter, returning us to the familiar themes of Jerusalem the goddess. The chapter is filled with Exodus and wilderness imagery, once again linking the Exodus story with the Babylonian exile. It begins by stating that the people escaped and found favor in the wilderness, a reference to the idea we've already seen that survival depended on surrender to Babylon, not battlefield victory. Yahweh revealed himself to maiden Israel long ago, and his love for her drives his desire to restore her to past glory. But her disobedience invites his wrath, and he sends enemies from the north to punish her. There is misery and mourning across the land. She is Rachel, weeping for her child, and Yahweh's response is to command her to cease her crying, as he promises to one day restore what has been lost. As he demands her return, she wavers like a rebellious daughter. But a time will come when daughter Israel will return, and with her the people who will inhabit the land and plant fields and occupy the cities and shepherd their flocks. A new covenant is promised to Israel and Judah, unlike the broken promise made with their ancestors. This new covenant will be inscribed in their hearts and will not be broken by them. No longer will there be a need for Yahweh's teaching to be taught to the people, because they'll know it in their hearts and heed his words, and their sins will be forgotten. These promises are delivered as a sequence of visions that occur in a dream, which our author awakes from in verse 26. Yahweh then claims authority by right of creation, and we're treated to a brief creation story as he establishes the sun and moon and stars to light the day and the night. He kicks up waves in the sea, and all this is according to laws that he has written. If you want to learn more about this covenant and creation theology that's being referenced here, I suggest listening to episode 52, which deals with the middle portion of 1st Enoch, as well as episode 39. It's truly fascinating stuff, but unfortunately I don't have time to dive into it here. But as a teaser, I will tell you that their theology held that the universe was organized and maintained by a set of laws established by Yahweh. To maintain this order, certain conditions had to be met, and failure to meet these conditions would lead to the annihilation of the heavens and the earth, and the forgiveness of sins of the nation was part of an annual ritual that maintained this delicate balance. Back to the story. Yahweh mentions the vastness of the heavens above and the stone foundations that hold up the earth below, a clear reference to the idea that these people believed in a flat world supported by stone pillars. Following this, he promises that the city of Jerusalem shall be rebuilt, and the entire area surrounding it shall be considered holy, and will never again be destroyed. This is a clear reference to the reconstruction during the Persian period, and if this had been a real prophecy, the author would have known that a few centuries later, the entire area would have once again been destroyed by the Romans, whose actions so mirrored that of the Babylonians that late 1st century Jews would reference Rome by calling it Babylon. Chapters 32 and 33 deal with the siege of Jerusalem and the offering of hope to the exiles. Jeremiah is imprisoned for predicting the destruction of the city and the capture of King Zedekiah. A detail of note here is that the text reads that King Zedekiah will be brought to Babylon, but the Masoretic text adds, "until I take note of him," as Yahweh will remember his exile and restore hope to the imprisoned king. Jeremiah then offers some hope to the Israelites that one day in the future, houses, fields, and vineyards will once again be owned by the people. The prophet proclaims the might of Yahweh by recounting his creation of the universe and wondrous deeds wrought in Egypt as a reassurance that he has the power to also restore the nation after its destruction. Just as he once freed the same people from Egypt, so too will he free them from Babylon. Included in this promise of hope is the use of the fictional account of the Egyptian exile and conquest of Canaan, to justify their current conquest of Israel following the Babylonian exile. Beginning in verse 31, Yahweh lays out his reasoning for sending his wrath against the city of Jerusalem. The inhabitants have revealed their wickedness and offended their deity, turning their backs on him and refusing to accept his warnings and rebukes. Rather, they built shrines and offered their children as burnt sacrifices in the Hinnom Valley. Because of these offenses, they'll be delivered into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. But eventually, he will treat them with graciousness and establish with them an everlasting covenant and restore them to their land. Chapter 33 brings Yahweh's promise of restoration to its thematic culmination, as it addresses the idea of the restoration directly. As Jeremiah is imprisoned a second time, he's once again visited by Yahweh and granted knowledge concerning the fate of Judah, Jerusalem, the temple, and the royal line. Yahweh promises healing and restoration as the people of the future have their sins forgiven and are established in their promised land before all the nations of the earth. Where once was only despair, now the streets will be filled with songs of joy and gladness. When this comes to pass, Yahweh will bring up a shoot from David to see justice done in the land as the people return to the land, a reference to Governor Zerubbabel who presided over Judah and served under Cyrus of Persia. This promise of a just ruler would be as strong as the covenant that Yahweh made with the sun and the moon to govern the day and the night. So as long as the sun rises in the day, a descendant of David will govern the land of Judah. Perhaps someone should tell the author of this chapter of Jeremiah that the Judean nobles would only control their land for a short period before being conquered once again. Our next section of the book is the interactions with King Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem, which is comprised of chapters 34 to 45. But for the sake of brevity, we'll only cover up to chapter 39 in this episode. The first two chapters deal with the fate of King Zedekiah and the faithfulness of the Rechabites. In chapter 34, verses 1 to 7, Jeremiah delivers an oracle pertaining to the fate of Jerusalem. Unlike previous oracles which focus on the city's capture at the hands of the Babylonians, this oracle stresses the destruction of the city through immolation. Yahweh has decided to hand over his favorite city to Nebuchadnezzar to be destroyed by fire, while King Zedekiah is captured and delivered to the Babylonian king. The Masoretic text adds the phrase, "You will not die by the sword," to the fate of Zedekiah in an effort to assure the reader that the last king of the First Temple period would have a peaceful death. He will also be afforded traditional funerary rites afforded to prior kings, including the burning of spices. All of this was told to the king by Jeremiah during the siege that would bring Jerusalem to its violent end. Another oracle from Jeremiah kicks off in verse 8 as a response to a recent proclamation by the king. Zedekiah outlaws the slavery of Judahites in the land so that all who currently own Judahite slaves must set them free. This is an attempt to demonstrate obedience to the covenant established in the Torah. The thinking is that if he satisfied some part of this law, then perhaps Yahweh will allow him to keep his land and his freedom. Unfortunately for the land, the people recaptured the freed slaves and forced them back into their old lives of servitude. So Yahweh steps in, beginning with verse 12, to declare that he had made a covenant with their ancestors when they had been freed from Egypt, that Hebrew people must be set free. Since these people didn't listen, they would be punished for their crime, giving us yet another reason for the destruction of the city. He then offers some small opportunity to escape a violent death: blood sacrifice. A calf must be cut in two, and any who pass between the two halves will be spared a violent end, and instead be handed over into captivity. Those who do not pass through the calf shall be destroyed by fire and by sword. In chapter 35, we're reintroduced to the Rechabites, whom we last encountered in episode 63, when one of their number, an overzealous fanatic named Jehonadab, led a violent purge of the Baal cult which resulted in mass butchery. Yahweh instructs Jeremiah to approach these religious extremists who live among the Judahites as resident aliens dwelling in tents rather than houses, and bring them to the house of a particular servant of Yahweh. Once in residence, they must forego their ancient customs to never dwell in houses or drink wine, in order to gain the safety offered to them within the walls of Jerusalem, while the invading army of Babylonians ravaged the countryside. Their obedience and willingness to break commands given to their ancestors in order to find safety within the city is used as an example in Jeremiah's oracle, as he chastises the Judahites for breaking commands given to their ancestors, which leads to their destruction within the city. If only they had been willing to obey Yahweh's commands, they might be awarded the same protection as the Rechabites. And since these fanatics have kept Yahweh's covenant, they shall forever find peace to stand within his presence, while the Judahites are sent away into captivity. The final section we'll be covering today concerns the fall of Jerusalem and runs from chapters 36 to 45. We'll see the first 4 chapters today and finish off this section in the next episode. In the opening lines of this section, we're introduced to a character named Baruch, who serves as Jeremiah's scribe. Later tradition will state that all of Jeremiah was penned by this person, though the knowledge of their post-exilic return, which is evident within the text, precludes this idea. However, it should be noted that there is archaeological evidence that Baruch existed as a scribe prior to the Babylonian exile, a claim we cannot make for Jeremiah. This evidence comes in the form of a clay seal bearing his name and title, so it's possible that some portions of this book actually contain the words of this man and were subsequently gathered up and attributed to Jeremiah in the post-exilic period. In the opening lines, we learn that Baruch is pinning the words of Jeremiah onto a scroll because the words must be read inside the temple, and Jeremiah the prophet isn't allowed inside. Baruch then enters the temple with the book of Jeremiah in hand and reads it to all those within the temple, as well as the people gathered outside who came from across the land. One of the princes who heard these words sent for Baruch to bring the scroll and give a private reading to the nobility, which prompted them to relate the oracles of Jeremiah to the king. But they warned Baruch to go into hiding with Jeremiah for fear that the prophecy of impending doom would lead to charges of sedition. This recalls chapter 26 as Jeremiah faced capital charges at the very same gate where Baruch is now said to have read the scroll. The scroll was brought before the king, who carved off bits of it as it was being read and tossed them into the brazier to be consumed in flames. His dismissal of the prophecy of doom invites Yahweh's wrath, causing the prophecy to come true, and the announcement that the city will be destroyed in fire just as the scroll had been. The king commanded the princes to arrest Jeremiah and Baruch, but they were hidden, not by their own doing, but by divine intervention, as Yahweh himself is said to have hidden them away for their own protection. At this point, we must ask ourselves one simple question. If the destruction had been caused by the burning of the scroll, would acceptance of the prophecy of destruction have saved the city, and thereby caused it to be a failed prophecy? This is what I shall refer to as Baruch's paradox. Yahweh's response to the destruction of his eternal words is to visit Jeremiah again and recount everything he said the first time around, along with even more chapters and verses, so that Jeremiah and Baruch can create a new and expanded scroll of Jeremiah. And if you think this is wild, it happened again with the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith. While writing the Book of Mormon, which he wrote by staring into a hat which contained some magic rocks while he dictated the divine words, which those rocks revealed to his own personal Baruch to write down, one of his wives took the book and burned it. Forced to start over from scratch, Smith attempted to tell the same story he'd made up during the first round of hat gazing, but of course it was significantly different because he was having to make it all up a second time. To account for the discrepancies, Smith told his friends that the angel Moroni had foreseen the destruction of the first copy, and so had given Smith incorrect scripture to be burned, so that the second version, which was the really, real, true version, would be recorded accurately, and no copies of the true scripture would have been destroyed. Anyway, back to Jeremiah. This entire sequence has nothing at all to do with any of the words written prior to the exile. This is a polemic against those who would reject post-exilic reforms to their religion. The scroll of Jeremiah, which the king burned, is a stand-in for the new scriptures introduced during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the king is a stand-in for those priests who rejected said reforms. By penning this scene, the post-exilic reformers paint a clear picture of the destruction that befalls those who refuse to accept the new words of Yahweh, and thus the words of Persian reformers. We've already seen this exact same argument used in regards to human sacrifice, shedding innocent blood, improper worship of Yahweh, acceptance of other gods of the pantheon, and most recently, the taking of Hebrew slaves, each of which are used in this book as the reason given for Yahweh's destruction of the city. No prophet story is complete without a trip to the underworld, and Jeremiah is no different. Like Zarathustra and Joseph before him, he must spend some time in darkness and be summoned before the king to offer assistance to the throne. He has two such stories, one which sees him tossed into a dungeon and another where he's thrown into a muddy cistern. Thankfully, the Bible preserves both. The first of them, the dungeon story, arrives in chapter 37. Upon ascending the throne, King Zedekiah sent messengers to Jeremiah asking him to intercede on behalf of the nation to persuade Yahweh to spare Jerusalem from the wrath of the Babylonians. He also places his hope in the Egyptian army that had departed from Egypt and presently approached the land of Judah, though I've heard this takes 40 years, so it may be a bit of a gamble. Yahweh's response, which came through Jeremiah, was that the Egyptian army would return to Egypt and the Chaldeans would return to Jerusalem to resume their siege, so trusting in men to solve man's problems is foolish, as they should only trust in their deity. He reiterated his point by saying that even if Jerusalem could defeat the entire army, and only those who currently sat wounded in their tents remained, they would still be enough to take the city and burn it to the ground. After delivering such terrible news to the king, who already didn't like the prophet, Jeremiah decided to exacerbate his problems by attempting to sneak out of the city at a time when people were deserting their posts to side with the Babylonian army. His excuse was that he had to see to an inheritance of property outside of the city walls, because the best time to survey some land is when the countryside is swarming with plundering invaders. So he's arrested, beaten, and imprisoned for sedition. Despite these traitorous actions, the king still needed the traitorous prophet to intercede with Yahweh, so he had the criminal brought to his palace so he could ask if Yahweh had yet responded. And because Jeremiah liked sticking his foot firmly into his own mouth, he said, "Sure, there's a response. Yahweh said you'll be handed over to the king of Babylon." After this, he asked to know why he'd been treated so poorly, as if he hadn't issued a doomsday prophecy concerning the city and the king and tried to slip away with the rest of the deserters. Zedekiah felt sorry for the prophet, so he had him moved to a different prison with more favorable conditions and increased his bread rations. That is, until the bread ran out due to the ongoing siege. Chapter 38 contains our second story of Jeremiah in the underworld, this one more closely resembling Joseph's descent into the pit than the previous tale does. In this version, it is Jeremiah, not Baruch, who delivers the fateful message which enrages the people, and they chant for his execution. While chapter 37 had the princes hiding Jeremiah from the king, here it's the princes encouraging the king to execute the prophet. Zedekiah, his power obviously waning during the siege, washes his hands of the entire matter and places Jeremiah's fate firmly in the control of the vengeful princes, who promptly dump the prophet into a muddy cistern. Into our story steps Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian court official who intercedes on behalf of Jeremiah with the king and convinced His Majesty that a muddy cistern might not be the best place for Jeremiah. In the Masoretic text, the Ethiopian accuses the princes, but in the older text, he places the blame firmly on King Zedekiah's shoulders. So Ebed-Melech takes 3 men to fetch the prophet from the cistern, hoisting him up with rope made of bedsheets. Jeremiah is then summoned by King Zedekiah to offer counsel concerning the fate of the city and of himself. Jeremiah suggests willingly surrendering to the Babylonians, which was the very crime he was imprisoned for. As with the previous story, this one likewise ends with Jeremiah being moved to the court of the guard to remain a prisoner until the fall of the city. One detail of note before we move on from this chapter is that the Masoretic text has the king express concern for Jeremiah's safety and encourages the prophet to keep the topic of their discussion secret in order to protect the prophet. But in the older versions of Jeremiah, they have the king issue death threats to ensure the prophet's silence, as he knows that the discussion and its outcome could lead to both their executions. It seems our Masoretic redactors wish to portray Zedekiah in a more favorable light. Our final chapter of this episode can be divided into two parts. The first 4 verses dealing with the capture of Jerusalem, and the last few concern Ebed-Melech's reward. When the king realized that the city would fall, he and a handful of his people escaped through a small gate and fled by cover of night into the wilderness, but were soon captured near Jericho and delivered to the king of Babylon, who promptly executed Zedekiah's sons and all the nobles of Judah. Then Zedekiah was blinded and carried off in chains to Babylon. His house burned, and the walls of the city were dismantled. The remaining populace within the city was deported to Babylon to serve as slaves. Jeremiah, on the other hand, was treated with care, with his own personal guard appointed by the king of Babylon to see to his safety as he was escorted home to live with his own people. A just reward for his pro-Babylonian rhetoric and oracles, and a possible hint that there was more to his sedition story than we've been told. Some commoners were left behind to tend the fields and keep the land going as a source of food for the Babylonian Empire. Something of note here, in chapter 39, verse 8, it mentions the burning of the house of the people, a phrase that appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, so its meaning is unclear, though it might be a reference to the Jerusalem temple. If so, then this story recounts the temple burning, not just being looted and dismantled. The scene abruptly returns to a point when Jeremiah was still imprisoned in the court of the guard. Then, before the city fell, but after his rescue of Ebed-Melech, Yahweh suddenly appears to Jeremiah and gave one final oracle before the city's destruction, telling the prophet to carry words to comfort the Ethiopian rescuer. Yahweh says he is doing evil to the city, not good. But for Ebed-Melech, he will be delivered from his wrath and won't be handed over to the Babylonians, nor will he die by the sword. He will escape with his life because he served Yahweh. And with that little scene appended to the end of the chapter, we end today's episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.